If you love Review Mirror Chronicles podcast and you want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. There is an absolutely beautiful church near Pudding Lane in London called St. Magnus the Martyr. And it's a very historic church. It was actually burned down originally during the Great Fire of 1666, and it was then rebuilt. It was one of the churches that was rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren, and it's absolutely stunning. The architecture, external and internal, is just jaw-droppingly amazing, absolutely amazing. But it's also got a really nice garden outside, and even on a cold winter's day, if the sun is shining, it's a beautiful place to sit. Contemplate your navel and all that kind of stuff. But I think what's really cool about it is that you can actually walk around these little lanes and find these little churches that are very near where the Great Fire of London actually took place. And of course, it all started on the 2nd of September, 1666, when a very small fire broke out in a little bakery in Pudding Lane. But in 5 days, that fire had destroyed the vast majority of one of the largest cities in Europe, if not the world. Exactly what happened that week in 1666? Well, sometimes we feel a little bit sorry for ourselves in the modern world, don't we? And then when that happens to me, I think, you know what? I could have been alive in the mid-1660s. I mean, that was a brutal time to be a Londoner. We also forget the Great Plague that had happened the year before the Fire of London that had the most appalling casualties. People don't really realize how bad the plagues were, but there was absolutely no cure for them back in those days. And that particular plague that took place in 1665 had a 9 out of 10 mortality rate. So effectively, if you got the plague, you died. There was no bones about that. And of course, anybody who was anybody cleared out of London, leaving only the poor and the dedicated, certainly kind of dissenting ministers who hung around and took the place of the Anglican clergy who had run off to Oxford or to the South Coast. And they're supposed to be the guys who are looking after everyone who gets the plague, but they don't. So those kind of dissenting, ministers really came into their own at exactly that time. They were effectively the welfare system that looked after the plague victims in London. They cared for you when you became ill, and they collected the bodies on plague carts at night. That being said, the streets of London, even without the plague, were completely festering in its own filth. London, by comparison of today, was tiny. The city of London itself, what we call the square mile, was home to probably about 80,000 people. And then what we think of as Greater London, the suburbs and, some of the outlying areas, they had a population probably of about 250 to 300,000. Although it's hard to be precise because there were no censures at the time that really kind of measured how many people were there. People moved in, people moved out, people died, and no one really recorded it, unless you were buried in a churchyard. And London at that stage, especially down by the Tower of London, down where Pudding Lane is, leading down to the Thames, they were living literally cheek by jowl. Most of the streets are very, very narrow, and you're living in mainly timber-framed kind of loft and plaster houses that would have had their first floor jutting out across the street, so that on some of the narrow thoroughfares that you would walk down, you can actually lean out of your bedroom window, your first floor bedroom window, and actually shake hands with your neighbor across the road. That's how tightly packed in these houses were. And of course, when you have houses like that, the sky is completely blotted out. And of course, fires are your threat in not just this area, but the time, the history. And I mean, there's actually a huge fire, the Forgotten Fire of London that took place in the 13th century, where over 3/4 of London was burned to the ground. But there were fires all the time. And they're there all the time because you're looking at a world that was actually lit by naked flame. People are always airing their clothes by putting them, especially in winter, by putting them in front of an open fire. Or if you were looking for a chamber pot, in the middle of the night, if you went looking for that under your bed with a lighted candle, odds were that the bed was going to go up in flames. So there were fires all the time in London. And the Great Fire of London, I think, was just a disaster waiting to happen. Of course, at the time it was an accident. It was a confluence. It was a meeting of 3 or 4 different events that, had any one of them happened by themselves, you would never have had the Great Fire of London. August and July were stiflingly hot. It was a massive, massive heat wave. There was a drought all the way through summer. So all of these timber buildings were tinder dry. And there was also a general sense of foreboding as well. It's weird that there had been rumors about Cromwellian Republicans kind of mounting a coup. There was also talk about a mysterious character called the Precious Man, who's supposed to be mobilizing a militia, to march on London. And of course, there was also talk about a messiah from the East, a man called Zabote Levy, who was gathering followers and was marching on London. So people were a little bit twitchy. But the big thing that people were twitchy about, considering that they were also dealing with this sweltering heat, was that on that afternoon of September the 2nd, 1666, it was a Sunday, the big thing was war. Britain was at war, and that's what mattered most. Britain was at war with the Dutch. And the war had actually been going really well for them. But that particular afternoon, what everybody was talking about, what everyone was talking about in the coffee houses, was that there was a massive English fleet commanded by Prince Rupert and George Monk. They were converging on the Dutch just off Boulogne. They were going to devastate them. This was the plan. They were going to sail straight in, bigger fleet, more powerful boats, and just wipe them out. And that's what everybody cared about. That's what everyone was talking about in the streets of London on this particular day. And of course, as that fleet moved in on the Dutch, with the wind moving in their favor, just a gentle breeze moving in their favor, it started to get stronger and stronger. And as they rounded Rochelle, it suddenly became a storm. And just as the English engaged with the Dutch, all hell broke loose. The gale hit both fleets at the same time. Masts were blown over and they snapped like twigs. Sails were blown out. And both fleets, fearing that they were all going to be sunk, ran for home. There was no battle. They just ran for home, kind of crashing into each other as they did, colliding, which increased the panic. Ships actually turned over and sank quickly with great loss of life. The English ran for the Isle of Wight to kind of lick their wounds, but really kind of hide from the storm. And of course, the point about all of this, if you're wondering why on earth I'm talking about it and what it has to do with the Great Fire of London, the point is that afternoon and evening, that gale moved up into Kent from the Channel. And that night, it grew in strength, and it moved up through Kent. As it went, it toppled chimneys, it lifted thatch roofs, and it hit London at about 1 a.m. on the morning of the 2nd of September, initially cooling the residents and offering respite from what had been a long, long hot summer. But just as it hit in force, a baker called Thomas Fariner forgot to put his oven out in Pudding Lane. He'd done it before. This wasn't the first time. He'd actually done it many times, but of course without the consequence. But if those two things hadn't happened, if Fariner hadn't forgot to put his oven out, and if the gale hadn't hit, there would have been no Fire of London. And before I talk about Thomas Fariner and the fire, I mentioned that there was a terrible drought. I was actually reading Geoffrey Parker's magnificent, gigantic book about the 17th century, kind of climate catastrophe that took place across the planet at that time. And he actually points out that there were numerous other fires around the world at that time too. So there was a massive fire in Tokyo that is thought to have killed over 100,000 people in 1657 and destroyed 70% of the city. There were also massive fires in Moscow in 1654, in Constantinople in 1660, and in Copenhagen in 1728. All right, the Copenhagen one's a little bit later, but I think it just goes to show that even though this fire took place in 1666, there we are 60 years later, and we're still getting these massive fires. And of course, there were big fires not only in London, but all over England. I think to go back to what I was saying earlier, it was a world that was actually lit by open flame. And what that meant was that fires broke out all the time. Most of the time, they weren't that serious, but occasionally they were. And there may be a climate story or a climate change story to talk about here, but I'm not sure that we can actually associate climate change with the fact that you've got an entire society that depends on an open flame. Accidents, they just happen. They just do. So Thomas Fariner, he's a baker, and embers just kind of popped out of his oven that day and ignited what was nearby. Interestingly, he always said it wasn't his fault. But let's face it, if I accidentally just burned down the second largest city in Christendom, I'd probably say it wasn't my fault either. But what seems to have happened, what we know is that in the early hours of the 2nd of September, that Sunday morning, Fariner's manservant woke him up. He came upstairs and he said, "There's smoke coming up from the basement," which is where the ovens were. And Fariner and his daughter Hannah and the manservant then tried to get downstairs, but the smoke was too thick. They couldn't get down to the ground floor. So they clambered out of a bedroom window and into their neighbor's bedchamber, which must have been quite a shock for the neighbor at 2 o'clock in the morning. The maidservant, however, had a fear of heights, so the story goes, and she wouldn't jump, and she wouldn't walk out onto the roof, and she actually died of smoke inhalation, and she was the first casualty of the fire of London. They then raised the alarm, and keep in mind, at this time, folks, it's not that big a deal. Yeah, it's a bit of a fire down there, but it's not that serious. And of course, there were certain things that always happened when a fire broke out. Neighbors would evacuate their houses. Usually, the parish wardens would be called. And of course, you would then get the firefighting equipment, which was mostly kept in the local church. And most of the effective firefighting equipment was it consisted of long poles with hooks on the end, pulling down thatch, and also for pulling down houses to form fire breaks. So everybody kind of milled around, not really doing anything. And the point is, though, as they're milling around in Pudding Lane, as they're kind of thinking about putting the fire out, this gale is blowing. And it's blowing from the east and it's blowing westward. It's fanning the flames. As it fans those flames, some of the thatch lifts. Those embers start flying into the sky and they land in the streets next door. Famously, a glowing ember lands in the stable yard of an inn on Fish Street Hill and just ignites the straw, almost immediately. That was then blown up into the air, and of course, that spread. So the fire is spreading all the time. The gale is absolutely relentless, and this gale will blow for 3 full days. And it's the gale which is now causing the fire of London now. The mayor of London wasn't super concerned. He was called Thomas Bloodworth. And Thomas Bloodworth was one of the unluckiest men in London. He had actually just come into office halfway through the plague. So, there's no Lord Mayor's show. There's no bluster to welcome the new mayor in. There's no pageantry. And he was actually sworn in a barbershop at the back of the Tower of London. So a very quiet affair. But it was all a bit of a frost for him. He'd never dealt with anything like this. And then just as he comes to the end of his year of office, he's called out at 2 a.m. on this Sunday morning and told there is a fire and that people are getting a little bit anxious and the fire is starting to spread. And they're starting to worry that maybe, just maybe, they need to do something a little bit more dramatic. One of the crowd cries out to him, we need to start demolishing houses. So he gets called out, and Bloodworth, he's not a great man, bless him. He's not a decision maker. He says he can't authorize the pulling down of the houses because he needs the permission of the owners. And because the vast majority of property in London is rented, the landlords could be anywhere. So he says, no, we can't demolish the houses, even though the fire is spreading. And one of the wardens actually says to him, look, this is getting serious. And Bloodworth famously says, this fire is nothing, mate. A woman could piss this out. And he went back to bed. and I guess also entered into the history books. That's it. He's in there forever. He's known as the mayor who wouldn't put the fire out. So I then wondered, at what stage does it become an incredibly serious situation? Well, we know it started in the early hours of the morning of Sunday on the 2nd of September. On that morning, Samuel Pepys, the Samuel Pepys, known for his detailed diaries, and they're amazing because they actually provide a unparalleled glimpse into, 17th century London. Well, Samuel Pepys is living just a few streets away in Seething Lane. He's living to the east of the fire, to the east of Pudding Lane. His maid wakes him up at about 2:30 in the morning and said that there's smoke down on the quays, down by the river, and it already looks as if there's several hundred houses burning. And Samuel is quite anxious about this because, well, he's got people coming for dinner, and he's a bit worried that they won't be able to make it. This is his initial reaction to the Great Fire of London. So he decides he's going to have a closer look. In fact, he goes up to the Tower of London. He's friendly with the constables there. So he goes up to the top of the Tower of London and he sees that the fire is spreading along the wharfs and the quays of London, where you've got timber and tar and flax all piled up. The flames are moving along at a steady rate and they're being pushed westward by this gale all the time, and they are moving steadily along the streets and wharfs by the Thames. Pepys realizes that this is going to be quite serious. I mean, he's a very smart man, and he gets in his boat and he sails up to Whitehall to tell the king what's going on. The king then offers to send his lifeguards. Remember, there's no standing army at this time, but he's got lifeguards, so he can offer military help. Samuel Pepys goes back into town and he finds Thomas Bloodworth, who's got out of bed again and is now running up and down the street of Cheapside with a handkerchief on his head saying, oh Lord, what shall I do? What shall I do? Well, I mean, you shouldn't have gone back to bed. I would say that's one of the things that you shouldn't have done. The other thing you should do is accept Pepys's offer of help. So Pepys basically says to him, look, the king's offered to send in the troops effectively, and Bloodworth immediately says, oh, no, we can't have that. And he says it because it's only a few years since General Monk had broken down the gates of the city and marched into the city of London with his army. And there's an understandable fear of military might, if you like, in the city of London. So Bloodworth again makes this massively wrong decision, and he says, we can handle this. We don't need the king's troops. And then he goes back home. He just cannot get it right. So what other means are there to help put this out? Well, there were buckets and chains, and there were a couple of fire engines in the city, but they're not anywhere near the fire engines that we've come to know. Keep in mind also, the fire hose, as we know it, wasn't actually invented until 1673. And anything resembling a fire engine that we would recognize, not until 1905. In London in 1666, they had a massive sled with cisterns on top and a brass spout that you could dribble water out of into a bucket. If you actually want to put that on the fire, then you've got to get really, really close to it. And it's probably an improbable thing to do when the fire actually, kind of reaches its zenith and it's way too hot. But anyway, there's a fire engine that is brought down from Clerkenwell, which is only 1.5 miles away. And it's dragged down by men who then move it to the bottom of Pudding Lane to the riverbank to fill up the cisterns so they can start spurting water, I guess, or, putting water into buckets to put the fire out. Unfortunately, they get too close to the bank of the Thames, and the fire engine slides into the Thames and sails off down the river, and no one ever sees it again. And the important point about these initial stages then is that nobody's actually putting the bloody fire out. Everybody's looking for themselves, and everybody is trying to evacuate their own goods. And of course, there's looting going on all the way down the north bank of the Thames. I mean, what an opportune time to do something like that. There's a merchant called Towswell who's got a house just to the east of Pudding Lane near Bishopsgate. He rushes out into the street and finds men who are probably looting anyway, and then actually gives them money to evacuate all of his goods to safety. And they do. They evacuate all of his goods to safety, and he never sees them again. What this points to is that order is actually breaking down. And I think that's the important thing to note. And it's accelerated by the rumor that's going around already by Sunday evening that this is a revenge attack by the Dutch, that they are the ones setting the fires to the city. And basically, it's a prelude to an invasion. So save yourself. Now, this isn't as crazy as it sounds, because a few weeks before, on August the 19th, a force of English Marines under the very flamboyant Sir Robert Holmes, who used to wear this incredibly expensive gold lace suit, and he always carried a monkey on his shoulder, burned 150 Dutch merchant ships and then set fire to the town of Terschelling. And the English actually knew that as Robert Holmes's bonfire. So the raid was extremely controversial at the time because it was the first time ever that they targeted civilians purposely, commercial shipping, making it a particularly ruthless act, in maritime conflicts between the English and the Dutch Republic. And of course, everyone in London thought that this was a Dutch reprisal. And of course, then anyone who looked foreign was then beaten up in the streets. Crowds of men tried to lynch people. The rumors were spreading faster than a fire. And of course, Thomas Farron's bakery in Pudding Lane suddenly became a Dutch bakery, which was purposely, set on fire. He purposely burned his house down to start the fire of London. People were then seen throwing fire bombs through windows. Neighbors fought neighbors. And of course, none of these rumors were true, but the xenophobia and the fear had spread right through the city. You are listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles, and we're just going to take a short break and come right back. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia, and that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So when I give talks about the Great Fire of London, one thing that always comes up in the questions is, did Samuel Pepys really bury his cheese? It's just the weirdest thing, right? But he did. He actually had a massive slab of Parmesan cheese that he didn't want damaged in the fire, and he buried it. Pepys is the best of all the narratives about the fire, hands down. Not surprisingly, his account is the most vivid. And there's a moment that comes to mind where he actually sails down the Thames. He's on his way to Whitehall, and he sees the pigeons that Londoners keep for food fluttering above their homes. And he notes that their wings are singed and basically they just drop down into the flames. And it's such a memorable image. I don't know if many people died in the fire, to be honest. No one really does, because there wasn't a proper census after the fire. The fire, although it spread kind of inexorably, it didn't spread that fast. It spread, maybe 30 yards an hour. And so it wasn't a flash fire. People were caught out for sure, but not as they would be caught out if it was a flash fire. What we do know is that there were certainly 11 fatalities, and I suspect there were quite a lot more, but they were just unaccounted for. And these would have been people just caught when the fire broke out in front of them and behind them as it was happening in the streets of London. And I would guess that the real number, looking at some of the text that I've read, is probably closer to 40 or 50. And that's because it was a slow fire. What we do know is that consistently in the aftermath of the fire, people were actually thanking God that there were so few casualties. The fire was actually seen as punishment, and it really depended on whose side you were on. It was punishment because they had just killed their king, Charles I. Others argued that it was punishment for attacking the Dutch a couple of weeks before. But in spite of God punishing London, he had actually shown them extreme mercy. And everybody says this. So it's pretty clear, I think, that there were surprisingly few casualties. Speaking of the king, Charles II, He is in there kind of riding around this horse, but he's not really kind of getting involved. He's involved in a bit of an airy-fairy kind of way. He's riding around on his horse with a saddlebag full of coins, kind of flinging them to people on the streets and urging them to, help put the fire out. In fact, it's his brother James, Duke of York, who's the future James II of England, who is the absolute hero. Don't misinterpret me, though. I'm no fan of James II. James, Duke of York, when he becomes James II, I think he's got the political acumen of a chicken without a brain. He's completely useless as a king. But I have to say, as a man in a crisis, during the fire of London, he was an absolute hero. And this is a guy, keep in mind, who the previous year, as Lord High Admiral of the fleet, had gone into battle against the Dutch and had watched a round of chain shot. He was actually standing on deck with all of his senior officers, and a round of chain shot hit the group. Now, chain shot, if you're not familiar with it, consists of kind of two smaller cannonballs or iron bars linked together by a chain. It's deadly, devastatingly deadly. And when fired from a cannon, what happens is the chain shot spins rapidly through the air, creating this kind of whirling effect, slicing through anything it comes into contact with. And I mean anything. It will snap masts in half. So James, Duke of York, was miraculously unhurt as this chain shot hit his friends. But all of his friends actually exploded around him. And the only damage that he suffered was some cuts on his forearm from a skull splinter from his best friend. And you know what? He didn't bat an eye. He didn't even blink. He actually stayed on deck giving orders. So this guy is actually a very brave man. And he's the fella who, with his lifeguards, kind of rides down into the city and starts organizing, copper fire prevention. They organize cordons. They start to pull down houses. They evacuate entire streets. And he actually gets off his horse. He's not sitting there just giving orders. He gets off his horse. He takes his shirt off and he starts mucking in with the lines, throwing buckets of sand and water, with the best of them. He's an amazing man in the fire. It's just a shame that he didn't last a little bit longer. But golly, he was a good man. He was a very, very good man. So the fire actually peaks on the 4th of September, which is a Tuesday. And by that evening, the Royal Exchange is gone, burnt to the ground. The Guildhall, burnt to the ground. Baynard's Castle, burnt to the ground. And as the sun starts to set, a young Thomas Tazwell, a schoolboy at Westminster, he looks up into the city, he looks across at Lambeth Marsh, and he sees St. Paul's Cathedral, which is London. It means everything to London. This is the spiritual center of not just the city, but of the entire country. And what he sees has his heart racing. He sees flames start to lick around St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's is being repaired at this stage, and there is scaffolding all over the place, basically, all over the roof for sure. And flames catch that scaffolding because it's timber. The timber then falls down through the roof of St. Paul's, and the building explodes like a firebomb. That explosion is made much worse because the printers and stationers who are around Paternoster Row, around that area, around St. Paul's, some of them actually believe that the basement of St. Paul's, the crypt area, is the safest place for all their paperwork. And they decided quite early on during the fire that nothing would harm St. Paul's. God would protect them. So they put all of their paper, all of their books, all of their pamphlets, they stacked them up for safety in the crypt of St. Paul's. And when those timbers fell down into St. Paul's and then fell through the floor and into the crypt, boom, all of those papers went up. And that was where the explosion came from. And basically, St. Paul's just blew up. So what are we talking about in the city? Is it half destroyed? What's the final reckoning? Well, the monument to the fire, which still stands, which is just around the corner from Pudding Lane, it says it all, actually, doesn't it? It says that there were 13,200 houses destroyed, 400 streets and courts, nearly all of the livery halls, and about 5/6 of the city of London. One chap actually writes to his brother in Northumberland and says, London actually looks like our fells because all you can see are the remnants of brick chimney stacks. Everything else is flat and a smoking ruin. The damage and the lasting damage, huh? Well, what we don't know so much is the damage that is caused to the people of London, the psychological damage. So, I mean, for example, for years afterwards, Samuel Pepys was actually having nightmares of fire and falling, and he would wake up almost nightly. After the fire, his wife, Elizabeth, starts to lose her hair, and she then gets stomach upsets. And it's fairly clear that she's also got post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm sure that a lot of the Londoners would have suffered mentally as well. You know, the mental health would have been really severely damaged by this. So what about the rebirth of the city? What were the various competing ideas to recreate London as we know it today? Well, we know of at least half a dozen plans that were put forward to the king to rebuild London. Some were more sophisticated than others, and some of the less sophisticated ones involved just drawing, a checkerboard and saying, let's make London a checkerboard and build the houses according to that. Within days of the fire, Sir Christopher Wren, is professor of astronomy at Oxford, but he's also in the king's private chambers with a plan for redesigning the whole of the city of London. John Evelyn, also another famous architect, meets later with the king. Actually, he meets with the king straight after Wren. And look, I'm sure every architect in England had a go at a plan on how to rebuild London. I mean, what a fantastic opportunity. Christopher Wren's is by far, far the best and the most sophisticated idea. Yet, it didn't get put into action. It came close, though. It came very close. But the problem was that the king, quite early on during the fire, gave an undertaking that nobody would lose their homes or their land as a result of the fire. And Wren's rebuilding would have involved massive compulsory purchases. He was driving boulevards basically right through the center of London. It would have also taken a very long time, whereas the city authorities would rather that everybody just go ahead and build their own homes without a plan. So what they said to them was effectively just that, go ahead and rebuild. And of course, Wren's plan never got sufficient backing from the city authorities. That being said, if you want to see Wren's London, not quite the same, but pretty bloody close, go to Washington, D.C., because 100 years later, Jefferson and L'Enfant, when they were laying out the federal city on the banks of the Potomac, they took a published version of Wren's plan for London from 1666 and remade that. So what you'll see in Washington is Wren's London. I worked in London for a while, for a long time. And whenever I go back to the UK, I spend days wandering around the streets of London. And I've traversed those streets of 1666. I know them like the back of my hand. And what I can tell you is that those streets, those lanes, they're all still there. In spite of all the changes that's taken place, you can recognize virtually every street and every court and every alley. Next time you go to London, go to Pudding Lane and spend a good few hours just wandering in and out of those streets, and you'll get it. You'll really get a feel for what took place. What you don't get is the feel for the closeness, how close the houses actually were, because these lanes back then, you were lucky if they were 10 to 15 feet wide. And of course, obviously, there were changes after the fire, and I then wondered actually, what regulatory changes were introduced immediately. And there was actually several rebuilding acts, which, when you look at the acts, it's actually fairly clear. It actually states that the new streets have to be 30 to 40 to 50 feet wide, depending on the status of the street. All the buildings have to be built of brick or stone, or at least have a stone facade. These fire prevention measures are put in place very, very quickly. Literally, they're all in place within 2 to 3 years after the fire. But, and there's always a but, in reality, when you actually look at what happened 2 to 3 years after the fire, people actually just ignored the building regulations, and the streets are still 15 to 23 feet wide. The houses are still going up made of timber with thatch. And you really don't get that miraculous transformation. It doesn't actually happen until at least 50 to 60 years, maybe even 70 years, after the fire took place. It's a very slow kind of evolutionary thing. It's always fascinated me, and it fascinates me to this day, that London, having literally exploded, it then explodes figuratively, into the most important city and port on earth. And I then wondered what the relationship was, if any, between this fire and this extraordinary rebirth and rise to becoming probably the richest city on the planet. And I think there are two things there. One is that it was the most important city in England before the fire, hands down. And one of the reasons for the city authorities, kind of pressing ahead very quickly with the piecemeal rebuild is that they're scared that merchants won't come back to London. And, already places like Bristol are becoming, really important ports in the aftermath of the London fire. And one of the first buildings, if not the first building that they put back up in place, is Customs House, because they want to start getting in revenues from London as a port. The rebuilding is a piecemeal affair. I mean, now we look and we can see the importance of it. And I use that term very loosely, but I also use that term heartfelt. And I think St. Paul's Cathedral, which was then rebuilt by Christopher Wren, is the greatest building in the world. I honestly think it is. It's so, so beautiful. And of course, the other thing is that Wren then continues to build, and he actually builds an additional 56 city churches. And again, if you want more detail about Christopher Wren, please go back to that podcast I did earlier in the year. It's really fun. And I think you'll actually be quite surprised at how amazing Wren as a polymath is. And of course, then you've got the rebuilding of all the livery company halls. Those are incredibly important, and they actually add enormous status to London. And keep in mind also, even though he rebuilds St. Paul's, it's not done in a year. It actually takes 50 years to rebuild. None of the rebuilding of London happens overnight. And all the churches, of course, take another 40 to 60 years as well. What intrigues me, though, is the houses. You imagine a world where your home is your business, where you rent it, you don't own it, and then it burns down. So suddenly you've got nowhere to live. You've got no means of making a living. And there's also a clause in almost every single tenancy agreement saying that if the property is damaged, it's up to you to repair it. And there's no insurance. And the astonishing thing is that Londoners did that. Within 3 or 4 years, most housing in London was actually completely rebuilt. It's incredible, just incredible that people could actually get down and just do that on their own volition. In terms of the monuments, in terms of the memorializing the fire, obviously we still have the Great Monument, and it really is a fantastic monument. It's a strange thing to say about a monument, I have to say, because most monuments I'm actually really ambivalent about, but this one is actually quite stunning. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous. But there is something else on there as well. And this is, the rage to blame, which gave rise to the rioting, to the beating up of foreigners, to the near lynching of foreigners. People were convinced, long afterwards, that the fire was definitely a terrorist attack. And there was a plaque put up which actually said, "Here by permission of heaven, hell broke loose on this Protestant city for the malice of barbarous papists whose fires are not yet quenched." And keep in mind also, somebody was actually hanged for starting the fire of London. Poor old Robert Huber, who I think was just a bit bonkers, actually insisted that he had started the fire. And the thing is, he hadn't even been in London, when the fire began. But he was apprehended like a lot of foreigners as they tried to leave the country just after the fire, because there was a belief that they started it. Foreigners tried to leave the country because it really wasn't a safe place for them to be. If you looked a little bit different, and you were walking around London, likelihood someone would stab you. So this poor guy's apprehended, he's arrested, and he says, "Yep, I did it. I put a firebomb in Thomas Farriner's bakery in Pudding Lane." And of course, they don't believe him, but then he takes them to Pudding Lane. He's obviously been to Pudding Lane before, which is, now just in ruins. It's basically just a flat wasteland. And he says, This is where the house was, and this is where I stood when I threw the firebomb that started the fire of London. In a way, he's a very sad version of someone just looking for that 15 minutes of fame. And by golly, they get it. So what they get is a confession. But as I said, everybody knew that he didn't do it. But he also then refused to retract his confession. So they hanged him. Isn't that an extraordinary story, folks? If you go to London and you go to Pudding Lane, which is a very long lane now, kind of leading down to the Thames with some beautiful buildings on it, stand there in silence and you'll get a real feel for what Pudding Lane was, what London was at that time. Soak up the atmosphere. It's absolutely worth it. What an extraordinary story. All right, folks, thanks for listening in. Much appreciated as usual. And I'll look forward to chatting to you next week. Bye for now.